Good afternoon. I'm joined today by Rohit Chopra, a Democratic Commissioner for the Federal Trade Commission, where he's served since 2018. Before that, Chopra was the Assistant Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he did a lot of work on some important issues, including student loans. Commissioner, welcome.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
taking the time.
Good to be here.
So I thought I'd just kick this off with a very tough question. Yesterday was Halloween. Did you have a costume?
I did for a little bit, but not the whole night.
What was your costume?
I reuse a doctor's costume. It's a little bloody from the surgery.
Okay, so that leads to my next question. What do you think is the spookiest or the scariest issue facing American consumers and competition today?
Well, it's funny, spooky and scary in Halloween sounds fun, but it's pretty scary for a lot of people who are still seeing an economy that is fundamentally broken. We just see the latest statistics that small business starts are still sluggish, worker wages are still growing at extremely anemic paces, but it's actually not scary at all in many ways. For some people, CEO pay is great. The stock market is at record levels. And elites all over our society here at home and in Europe and China are doing great. So we need to actually approach a really scary economy with actually some aggressive action instead of just watching and waiting as things get worse and worse and worse.
And where do you see your role in all of that?
Sure. So one of the things that has been a real problem at agencies like the FTC is that it has been afraid to tackle some of the most tough economic problems in our society. The agency should not be something that's just about small-time scammers. It should be about confronting massive concentrations of power in our economy, ending conflicts of interest in some of the biggest businesses in our society, going after the practices that diminish workers' wages and independence, and fundamentally making sure that the economy is competitive and delivers benefits for everyone who wants to work hard. So there's a lot of ways to do it. We know that these mega mergers rarely deliver benefits, not only for the investors, but rarely for consumers, rarely for workers, and lax enforcement makes those problems worse. We need to actually look at all of the practices by some of the companies in our economy where we pride ourselves on an American dream where people get to work hard and start a business, but guess what? When you ask people in venture capital, when you ask a whole wide range of thinkers, it's harder than ever to break into most industries in our economy, especially now tech. We also have to figure out what we're going to do with some of the industries that literally people's lives depend on. And I now see our pharmaceutical companies not acting like scientific or medical organizations, but more and more like hedge funds. So the FTC has coverage over all of this, and we need to address these big problems with energy and fortitude, because we have so many challenges that we have to tackle.
So let me come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to touch briefly on what you were discussing about mergers. Just today, Fitbit announced that it's going to be acquired by Google in a deal that's valued at $2 billion, $2.1 billion. This is a deal that could give Google a bigger foothold in devices. It could also give it a lot more access to health information. And when I tweeted about this, noting a line in the announcement that Fitbit said its information won't be used by Google for advertising purposes, I got a lot of responses in my feed sort of saying, or, we'll see, or maybe for now. What do you think that says about sort of our current moment? And then there's separately an ongoing conversation about merger enforcement. how does that conversation guide us here?
So without speaking about this proposed deal, which may be subject to review by enforcers, just to zoom out, I think I have often asked the question, what would our economy look like online if Google had not bought YouTube, or if Facebook had not bought Instagram, and the list goes on and on. And what you see in some of the globe's biggest firms, and 7 of the 10 largest firms by market cap in the globe are American or Chinese technology firms, aggressively buying up and rolling up all sorts of firms. And the reason I think they're doing this is because the more and more data they can vacuum up, the more it powers their behavioral advertising model. Now, I've heard this before, that they're not using it for advertising, but guess what? As soon as it goes into the AI and machine learning, there's no way to audit how they learned something or how they did something. So I think when it comes to enforcement, we need to think not just deal by deal, but what is happening when a company is engaged in a string of acquisitions to essentially protect their dominance and turf. And if any company is doing that, that raises serious questions about not only if an individual merger is unlawful, but their entire activities around that. So I think there's a movement toward greater rigor when it comes to looking at some of these deals. I have been pushing harder for a lot more analysis and evidence-based decision-making at the FTC and federal agencies. And I think we need to look hard to determine whether some of these acquisitions, and again, I don't want to comment on that specific one, but it is a trend that we see in so many industries of our economy. So
there are a couple of audience questions here that sort of follow on that theme, and I'm just going to kind of roll a couple into one here. We have a question about what one big overlooked power the FTC has today that the public should know about, and sort of relatedly, how can the FTC stop working on sort of a whack-a-mole, case-by-case sort of basis and establish more of a broader, kind of more comprehensive approach to some of the issues that it deals with?
Well, the agency has so many authorities that really need to be dusted off. One of the ones you mentioned, or that the question raises, is the FTC has an authority to conduct industry-wide investigations, compelling data from companies across an industry to be able to synthesize what the business practices are and what they're actually doing. And I think sometimes without that evidence base, the public can't be confident that the agency actually has the facts to attack a problem. We can't look at each sector of the economy the same way. Each has their own nuances. So we should be using Section 6B of the FTC Act more aggressively, especially when it comes to digital markets. The other thing is, I along with Lena Khan, wrote an article about the FTC's Unused Competition Rulemaking Authority, which would provide the option to attack many problems in our economy. And in the article that will appear in the University of Chicago Law Review, we specifically talk about things in pharmaceuticals like pay for delay, problems with anti-competitive practices against workers like abusive use of non-compete agreements. So I hear a lot that the issue is the FTC needs more resource and authority. And sure, that may be true, but I'm focused on making sure we use the truly expansive authority that we have effectively and with a real analytical base, not just shooting from the hip.
So earlier this year, Chairman Simons told Congress that preparations for a 6B study into digital markets was underway. And as recently as a few days ago, Commissioner Wilson told me she's supportive of that effort. But it's also been 6 or 7 months now. And I'm curious, why hasn't that happened yet?
Well, you'll have to ask the rest of them. I have been early on very supportive of using the 6B authority. Yeah, you know, the truth is that if we don't collect data and investigate, we will not get to the bottom of some of these business practices. And I don't want to be in the business of chasing old things that everyone knows is unlawful. I want to make sure we're finding the new stuff and the new shenanigans that are used to rig the rules against people.
Do you think there should be a 6B study conducted on the labor markets? I mean, the Justice Department has its own kind of study underway on labor markets and competition in the labor marketplace. Where does the FTC have a role to play here?
Well, I'd like us to actually bring a case that has a good result when it comes to labor market competition. So just yesterday, the FTC voted to approve a settlement in a wage fixing scandal involving home health care workers, which are a group of people that are often subject to, you know, what was discussed earlier today, contracts. They're not full-time employees. The conspirator scheme to suppress their wages. And guess what? The FTC settled the case for no money, no admission of liability, no notice to the victims, no bans on business practices, simply a promise not to break the law again and submitting some paperwork. So what message does that send to big tech platforms who might be arranging wages for gig workers? It sends a message, and I fear that we're simply not going to take it seriously. This is the type of conduct that can be criminally prosecuted, but we settled on the cheap. Actually, I can't even say on the cheap because we got zero. So we have to actually sharpen our enforcement when it comes to blocking mergers that harm worker wages and suppress competition. And when we find some of the worst, almost criminal behavior, we can't just settle with a promise not to break the law.
So you've been a very vocal critic of what you've called weak settlements, and you've specifically called out the Facebook and YouTube settlements that the commission's secured. The chairman said, he has to balance sort of competing interests here, what he can get from a settlement versus what he might be able to get by going to court and potentially getting less or losing a case. Do you think that the FTC needs to be willing to lose more cases, or to risk getting less from a lawsuit than it might otherwise get from a settlement?
Well, so I actually completely reject parts of that argument, because you asked about in the context of the Facebook settlement. Of course, I said that I would have been willing to go to court. But when the agency doesn't even interview or get sworn testimony or documents in the custody of Mr. Zuckerberg and Ms. Sandberg, this whole idea about going to trial is theoretical. This is not a complete investigation. The FTC has clear authority to compel documents, to compel testimony. And I don't understand how this can be seen as a credible investigation unless the alleged perpetrators of a wrongdoing, whether it's a corporation or its executives or a small-time scammer, until we get testimony and documents from them. So that's one. But to answer your question as a general matter, I think we need to really recognize the public benefits of litigation. Commissioner Vestager, who will take a higher position in the European Commission shortly, she and I have been saying the same thing, that big fines are not big penalties for the globe's biggest corporations. And I think what happens is that firms of that size and dominance and power know how to play the game. They can pay a fine that gets a big headline, and they can pocket the rest as profits and move on. And I think the difference is that when you sometimes go to the mat, seek fundamental fixes to the wrongdoing of their business incentives, and sometimes that's going to mean going to trial. But I think part of it is I want to see more rigor in our investigation, and if needed, go to trial.
So Facebook's disclosed that it's currently under a separate FTC investigation, and I realize there's probably limits to what you can say about that specific probe, but can you just talk generally about your confidence going into this proceeding and whether or not some of your concerns about the initial Facebook settlement will probably be addressed by this investigation?
One of the good things about the Facebook settlement was that it really woke people up to the fact that we got to watch closely this company and how the FTC will handle this next investigation. So I think that scrutiny is good. I'm also really glad that so many of our state attorneys general are getting in on this. I try and stay in constant communication with them because we've seen in history how when our state attorneys general are also pushing, it can really make a difference. Without the state attorneys general, there might not have been a Microsoft case. And without a Microsoft antitrust case, let me tell you, there'd be no Google, there'd be no Amazon, and there'd be no Facebook. Without aggressive antitrust enforcement by the states and the federal government, we will lose out on all of the promises of innovation and a dynamic economy.
One of the arguments that the tech industry's sort of laid out in recent months has been, if you come down too hard on the tech industry, all the innovation that happens in the United States will move overseas, particularly to China. Do you buy that?
Well, I get really concerned that the tech industry is kind of pushing these kind of dangerous things, because one of the things we have learned is that what really keeps America competitive is dynamic entry and fierce competition. We beat out most of Europe and the world when it comes to innovation by not having politically connected state-owned companies. We had it by decentralized business structures and an economy that had a lot of entry. So I think I don't want our economy turning more and more into China, which is I think what they're advocating for, is that we should have a couple big behemoths who apparently, I guess they're also arguing, get to follow a different set of laws than what every other company follows. So I'm worried about that. I fear this drift that if we do not have more small business starts, more entry, and just corporate royalty, this is not what the American economy is all about. That's actually more like what the Chinese economy is about. And I think we have to resist that.
Another audience question here. We see killer acquisitions rising in the prescription drug manufacturing industry and now big tech. What is the FTC doing to combat this rising anti-competitive practice?
Yeah, so just to give context on the question, killer acquisitions, let's say one drug company has a branded drug and another company is in development of a new drug for the same type of therapeutic area or illness. That company might buy the one who's developing one and simply unplug it, just turn it off. Cheating is not competing, and that is what that is. So I hope that every agency, whether it's a state AG, the FTC, the DOJ, will actually put a stop to some of these. We got to push to make sure it happens, but I do think that there's a growing consensus that we have to put a stop to them.
shifting gears a little bit, there's a lot of focus now in the tech press on facial recognition, artificial intelligence, and the impact that that will have on the economy. One, talk to me a little bit about where you see there being potential anti-competitive effects through the use of this technology. And second, we have companies like Amazon that are acknowledging that they're working on draft regulations that could govern some of this technology. Should we be worried about companies that are building the technologies proposing the very regulations that could would potentially aim to regulate them?
Yeah, well, before I answer the facial recognition part, this thing about Amazon is developing regulations, and we heard after Mark Zuckerberg's speech that it was statesman-like. Statesman-like. This is state. We should describe leaders of countries as statesmen and stateswomen. It is a problem, this blurring of who actually controls the rules of our economy. Is it people through their elected government, or is it through those who are already dominant? And this is a worry for me, because when it comes to facial recognition, here's what happens. Some innovator gets to introduce it, and if it goes well, they get to actually keep almost all of the benefits and the profits. But when it goes badly, and guess who it harms? It harms overwhelmingly people who are people of color, who are already economically disadvantaged. So this is a big problem. I follow this very closely, and I see there's been many cities across the country who are banning facial recognition for law enforcement purposes. I really think we need to take a much harder look also at facial recognition for commercial use, because we don't want to have we already live in a society where there's more personalized pricing. There's a lot more that is directed to us based on personal data. And we know that some of these facial recognition technologies don't even work well. And guess where where it doesn't work the best? People who have darker skin in America. And so if we are not ahead of this and simply take this position that let's wait and see, let's let it flourish, this is not a strategy that works. So I think we don't even understand how facial recognition and what biometric data points, and I think it's also important we broaden the issue beyond facial recognition and to biometric data collection in general. We actually don't know. It's a complete black box about how it feeds a lot of this artificial intelligence that is increasingly dictating a lot of the business opportunities and societal outcomes that we have.
I want to drill down a little bit more on sort of the relationship between businesses and government here, and come back to this idea of Amazon developing regulations that it hopes to be regulated with. Is there a regulatory capture problem that Americans should be concerned about?
Well, so let's distinguish. There's actually regulations that are developed through the democratic process. And of course, political influence of corporations and regulatory capture is of course a problem throughout our government. But I just want to make sure one thing is clear. There's also regulations that companies impose on their own outside of their democratic process through these take it or leave it contracts. So when you submit an app to an app store, you're agreeing to all of Apple and Google's regulations. When you're a seller on Amazon or another big platform, you're agreeing to a lot of their regulations. And you don't have the ability to negotiate that. And they can use those terms, which are take it or leave it, not just to impose things like forced arbitration, but all sorts of unilateral changes to collect more data and to make more changes that, guess what, always benefits them in their favor. Now, the FTC actually has quite a bit of history in banning some of these contract terms and these terms of service. And I've argued that we need to look hard at the clauses that we might want to restrict or ban.
So where do you draw the line then between change in terms of service and simply a product decision that a company might make. And the example I'm thinking of here is, Facebook's policy on truthfulness in political advertisements, which is a product decision that they've made, but has the potential to have, ramifications for political speech across the spectrum.
Yeah, well, look, that's what you're raising is fundamentally a question of this is the consequence of when we don't have lots of competition and lots of players. The more consolidation and dominance you have, the more likely it is that a single player will have their product decisions will have massive effects on society. I distinguish that a little bit from the regulations, but it's also a concern. I mean, the fact that those decisions have huge societal effects, I think it just raises a question about, are there some individuals and entities that fundamentally they get to call the shots on things that have huge societal outcomes?
Wanted to touch briefly on privacy issues. We've seen a number of policymakers talk sort of obliquely about how privacy is not just a matter of consumer protection, but potentially an aspect of competition that products can compete on the basis of privacy, and that therefore it could be considered an antitrust issue. Where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I think it's actually becoming more. It's not. Of course, privacy it has two aspects when it comes to antitrust analysis. One is that it's a quality indicator, of course. So you want firms competing on privacy, and the second is that privacy and data collection is also a function of price. So if I am using a service online, the companies and their lobbyists say, oh, it's free. But actually it's not free, because the data that they are collecting at us every moment can be monetized for big bucks. So it's more like a barter. And so when they're changing terms, or when it's, they just collect whatever data they want, it's not easy for us to judge what is really happening with this transaction. And the net effect of it is that it's an ongoing price increase if they continue to change. If they lock in a consumer and change the terms of service over and over to collect more and more and more data, that's a price increase to me. So I think it's certainly part of the analysis.
So you're saying just because it's free doesn't necessarily mean there's no price effect.
Yeah, I mean, we have to start thinking differently, that in today's world, people consume and get services. They might not pay a monetary cost, but they're paying. These companies are not operating charities. They're obviously making money on it.
So we've just got a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask a slightly weedier question here. Recently, Senator Josh Hawley sent a letter to all 5 FTC commissioners asking for the commission to hand over copies of a 2012 staff report related to the Google antitrust investigation, which was closed in 2013. And this week, Chairman Simons said he's not going to supply the letter, citing a whole bunch of exemptions under FOIA, basically. I'm curious if he was speaking for all 5 commissioners there, or could we see some of the commissioners break from the chair?
Yeah, well, that was not a vote that occurred. So there was no vote to determine whether or not to release that information. Look, I'll just say, big picture, the FTC and a lot of federal agencies need to do more when it comes to making things public. So I'm going to look at that. The situation was that it was an internal, memo, and every other page was inadvertently distributed, so it has some unique circumstances. But I think that the bigger question there is agencies that are more upfront and disclose more about their thinking. That's actually really good for the new businesses and the smaller players, because they don't have the ability to hire the ex-employees or hire people who work on this street to find out behind the scenes. So the more and more we can be transparent, the better.
Well, Commissioner, that's all the time we have today. So thank you for joining me.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.